'neath the desert moon. If you need a helping hand, I'll be there soon. Whatever happened to the land of the free? Does that still matter to you and me? Who's to blame? Not in my name. I think of friends I used to know. We laughed as kids and we watched each other grow. How did we ever drift so far apart? All of this anger in our hearts, who's to blame? Not in my name. Hey everybody, welcome back to the Noel Casler podcast. Episode 130. You may recognize that song from an earlier episode. I kind of stole the melody from Eddie Vedder. I didn't steal his voice. That's for damn sure. Anyway, it's good to see you guys. I missed you, man. Took a little break, trying to enjoy the summer, you know. But let's get into it. Back at it, huh? It's been a crazy time. There's a lot to catch up on. I'm not gonna take you through a recap of all the horrors as of late. I'm sure you're well acquainted with them. You know, I'm here to wish you well and catch up and share my thoughts. Thank you to everybody who's listening and always leaving nice comments. I really appreciate it. I hope everybody's staying cool. Climate change is on us, baby, you know, and it's no joke. It's heartbreakingly tragic, as we've seen in Texas. We lost 2 lives in New Jersey yesterday in the tri-state area. You know, people washed away in their car in Paterson, New Jersey. 2 people were in their automobile and they washed away. That kind of stuff doesn't happen here. More rain fell in Central Park in an hour than ever had in the history of New York City yesterday. So this is where we are, you know, and this is a result of the, you know, of the mass consumption of fossil fuels that we're all guilty of, right? It's everybody's lifestyle, you know, it's our economy and it's our country. But up until now, we would acknowledge it and we would have government agencies that studied the weather and they studied the effects of global warming on, you know, our society for safety, you know, and predicted storms and all of that good stuff. And then the drill baby drill guy came, you know, and he made everybody think that conserving energy was woke and you know, fossil fuels and coal and all this kind of stuff was the way to go, and solar power and renewable energy and windmills and all this kind of stuff are a thing of the past. And he legislated against it and he cut it out of our government, and it didn't take, you know, it didn't take till the 4th of July to have a horrific tragedy. You know, children were lost in a, you know, in a summer camp that was in Flash Flood Alley that obviously should have had a warning system in place. And I got a friend in Austin who's a distinguished professor. He's a well-known author and stuff. And he told me that, you know, this wasn't news to them in Texas. And the real reason, you know, a lot of the people pushed back against a warning system is that the guys with the ranches out there didn't want to get woken up, like the rich people didn't want to wake up in the middle of the night to some kind of horn or alarm because it did flood often, and people were thinking, well, it's not going to be that catastrophic. And obviously, in the case of these, little girls who were lost, it was the worst case scenario. And, it's horrible, and I don't want to make light of it or rub salt on anybody's wounds, and I'm sure you're paying attention to the news as it comes in about that, but, they sort of applied to be exempted out of the flood zone map. Business seems to always win out in Texas over lives, especially children's lives. We saw that in Uvalde. We see that how the state embraces the NRA. We see how they pass the buck. We see how they have press conferences like they had, with Governor Abbott and all these guys where they sort of jerk each other off and pat each other on the back and genuflect to Trump. And they don't talk about the victims. If my child is still missing under some debris, or I just lost them and they're talking about what a great job they'd done, it would make me murderous, I don't think I could live, with that heartbreak and then seeing the smugness of how they respond to people asking genuine questions. You know what? When you're a government official and people die, your job is to sit up there and take the hard questions and look for answers. That's the gig. It's not the, pageantry that they put on display of like, hey, we're Texas strong, and we don't pass the buck, and we don't place blame. We just get it done. Reality is they didn't get anything done. They didn't do anything to protect these kids, and they did a pretty horrible job of the recovery so far because there was nobody there to answer the phones at FEMA, and Kristi Noem didn't even send in the dive teams until Monday. That's what the federal government is for. And if you saw in the initial reaction, they were like, hey, it's a state problem. We're here to support, but we're going to let the state take the lead, which is insane, especially in a state like Texas, which has the lion's share of disasters. It has had more disasters than any other state, and they do not have a good track record of responding to them. That's not to say they don't have a lot of brave first responders. They do, and I know some of them. I toured with guys who were like ex-firemen in Dallas and stuff that worked security and EMTs on rock tours, and these are great guys. These are salt-of-the-earth dudes that you'd want pulling you out of a fire or a car wreck or something, So there's big, good-hearted people that I'm sure have been going through hell in the last 2 weeks, and I don't want to take anything away from what they've done or their response. They all deserve our respect. But the leaders, not so much, especially when you turn it into a clown show and you start talking about what a good job you did and please don't ask us any questions. We don't place blame in Texas. Governor Abbott sure was quick to place blame when he went jogging in a thunderstorm in River Oaks, okay? The name of the city, it's a part of Houston. It's a rich neighborhood in Houston. I have some family associates sort of that live there, but big trees are in the name, dude. And you went jogging, in a thunderstorm, and, unfortunately a tree fell on you and you got paralyzed, and you were quick to blame. You blamed the homeowner, and you blamed their tree service, and you sued them, in 1984, 85, and you got a, huge settlement, which has paid the man over $500,000 a year for over 3 decades. He's a wealthy man because he was quick to place blame, when he got in trouble in a weather-related situation. And then when he was Texas AG, before he was governor, he enacted tort reform and made it so other people couldn't get such big settlements from insurance companies. He sided with the insurance companies. You want to talk about pulling the ladder up behind you? That's a great example. And that's an ethos of Republican politics, of the greedy Republican politics, not what it used to be, not conservatism, not Teddy Roosevelt, these kind of scumbags who do this clownish cartoon performative bullshit and fill their own pockets and let everybody else suffer. It's enough to make you crazy, but anyway, let me just take a breath. That's not what I'm here to do. I'm not trying to make you crazy. And, I was in Nantucket when all that was going down, and it happened right after the bill was passed. This bill that's going to just gut this country in ways that I don't think people can really wrap their minds around. And it sort of got pushed out of the headlines. And, I know my audience, like you guys know what's coming. You guys know what's in there. But taking food away from kids, first and foremost, is a sin. And you're giving it to the wealthiest among us, the top 20% are going to get a tax cut, and you're going to pay for that by taking away people's health care. It's insane. And they're going after like a lot of people's health care, right? And a lot of people are on Medicaid. It's just not called Medicaid. I get health insurance through the exchange. It's the essential plan. It's funded by the federal government. I'm a freelancer. I didn't get health insurance in my life until Obama got elected, right? Because as a freelancer, they're not providing you. You're not working at a company that's giving you health insurance, and you never know when you're working. So you didn't have the money to pay $800 a month. And, when I was in my 20s and early 30s, I wasn't thinking about doing that. And there's been times where I've been on Medicaid, and it saved my damn life. When I got sober 20 years ago, I was unemployed. I was actually, before that, working for a company, and the owners lived in River Oaks, and they were billionaires and stuff. And that was like the one time I had health insurance. I had a little stint brokering semiconductors. I left live TV to try a day job in New York City for a while through a family connection. And it was a great experience, and they were wonderful people. But I was not cut out for the office life. And I went back to live TV, and then when I sort of bottomed out as an alcoholic, I was in trouble, and I ended up in the hospital more than once, and ultimately I ended up in NIH. That's why I went to rehab, and I was on Medicaid through all that, and I'm not ashamed of it. I needed it. There's no shame in it, If you go to Canada, your health insurance is included with your taxes. Most of Europe, that's how it works. That's how it should be. Healthcare is a human right. It shouldn't be a perk. It shouldn't be something that's, given to the privileged and taken away from the poor. And that's how the Republicans are using it. And that's going to bite everybody in the ass, okay? Because a lot of the Trump voters don't realize how many of them are on health insurance that's federally subsidized, right? It might not be called Medicaid in their state, but essentially that's what it is. And it's also Medicaid and Medicare that pay for, nursing homes and Alzheimer's care and all this kind of stuff, disabilities. People, Jimmy, I don't know what Jimmy's status is with that, but, he grew up with cerebral palsy, You need a supportive government to help people. And if you've listened to the show, Jimmy's one of the finest people I've ever met. That kid is smart and capable and a wonderful little journalist. He's not little, he's a grown man, but he's my little buddy. You know what I mean? But people who have special needs need some support to get ahead in life. And look how he's flowered. And he's a fortunate guy. He went to a fancy high school, and had wonderful father who passed away, and a wonderful mother, and he's gotten the most out of life, and you're going to take opportunities away from somebody else just like Jimmy, and that makes me so enraged. That makes me so mad. I've had people in my family that needed the help, and it was there, and you don't take that away. Who are we? What kind of nation lets kids go hungry, lets elderly old folks go without, insurance, lets anybody go that way? It's getting really hot in here. I'm going to have to pause this and turn on the AC. All right, I'm back. I hope that's not too distractingly loud. I'll turn up the mic a little bit. It's just I never run the AC, but I had to shut all the windows so you wouldn't hear all the road noise, and it turned pretty brutal in here quickly. We're in another heat wave. It's the second or third one of the season. It was never like this in the Hudson Valley when I was a kid, and now it's all the time. It's unbearably hot. But anyway, back to that bill. When that thing was passed, I was on Nantucket, and, I'm not rich, but, I know some people. So I get to go there. And it was like living in two different worlds, knowing what was happening, knowing what our government was doing, and then knowing that people have mega yachts and these beautiful homes, and they can go out and eat $50 lobster rolls and all this kind of stuff and not think about it. And that's not everybody there. That's sort of what it's morphed into in the last 10 years with the mega rich, and how that's kind of changed our society. But it was a weird paradox to watch Trump celebrate this bill, watch these weasels in Congress thank Jesus, for this wonderful opportunity to take away food, from the needy and destroy our government and our educational system and pat themselves on the back and then walk along docks and see people getting on $50 million yachts and stuff. It's gross. And I know a lot of those people, and they would happily have their tax money go to people's health care and being fed. They're not all Republicans up there. Ken Griffey's up there. He just had a big fundraiser. I think it's this week with J.D. Vance. It's $250,000 a plate. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine people sitting down and paying $250,000, first of all, to see that idiot, in the home of a hedge fund billionaire, and then knowing like that's what you're supporting? Who are we? And the wealth inequality has gotten so out of hand, and it's happened so quickly. It really is. It's staggering when you look at the numbers and how many handouts they're getting. Like, the wealthiest people among us in this country are paying less than your average working person. Jeff Bezos got a child tax credit in 2011, and he made $18 billion. He had such a good accountant that he qualified for it. There was something like over a dozen billionaires got PPP funds, or PPP, whatever it was called. Remember when they were handing out checks, stimulus checks, during COVID? Billionaires got them because they had good accountants, and they could qualify. That's insane. That should never happen, and we're entering an era where we're going to be governed by oligarchs, and we already are. And Trump is the oligarch in chief, right? So it's gone beyond a kleptocracy, and it's just an oligarch doling out favors. If you do business with him, you're fine, and you can print money and you can do crypto scams and whatever you want, and everybody else is screwed. And the fact that anybody goes along with it. I saw a family on the 4th of July in Nantucket. They were obviously coming over on a day trip, and the father, the mother, and the 3 kids all had Gulf of America shirts on. What does that say about us? That we're raising other generations in that kind of bigotry and ignorance. And they sort of came over to, to flaunt it, it seemed like. Let's go over and kind of like rub it in their faces. Because even though, even the wealthy people there that are benefiting from this stuff, they're not as stupid and crass as the foot soldiers of MAGA. And it's the foot soldiers that are going to get screwed, that are going to get swept away in floods and hurricanes. And when they call up FEMA and when they want their government to help them rebuild their home, it's not going to be there. When they want to send their kid to college, it's not going to be there. There was a thing in that bill where they've capped graduate school loans at $50,000. That means only rich kids are going to be lawyers and doctors, right? You're not going to get through your first year of law school borrowing $50,000. Right? You go to medical school, hundreds of thousands of dollars by the time you're done. They're capping that. So unless your parents can foot the bill, you're not getting basically higher education, postgraduate school. That's awful. That's not who we are. The whole point of America is you could come here, you could immigrate here, get a job in a factory, put a couple of kids through college, and your kid or his kid could be a fucking doctor or a lawyer. That's the American dream. And own a home. Everybody gets up, one level higher. You climb a ladder, and somehow that changed. And it's like I said earlier, pulling the ladder up behind you, or keeping it like this fiefdom, where only the country club elites get to rule. And there was obviously always an element of that, That's kind of, what our elite society was about. But we made it possible for a middle class to exist alongside of that, right? Not everybody was going to go to Yale and Harvard and live in Greenwich, and that's okay. Not everybody needs to do that, but you could have a good life out in Cleveland and send your kid to a great state school or a great private school, and they could go on and do something and create wealth and open companies and invest in things and innovate. That's what made us a great nation, and we're taking that all away. So a couple of scumbags could get a tax return, and they can control who gets to prosper, and then they can control what people study and learn, and they can take affirmative action and DEI out of our institutions, and they've done it, and they've intimidated them and got them all to bend the knee. Trump has come in like a wrecking ball. He's going after everybody because he knows what he's doing. He's an authoritarian, and he's on the march, and he's always been, and Now he's in a little bit of trouble with his Epstein stuff. And I'll get into that in a minute. I don't want to talk too much about it because you've been listening to this podcast. You know my thoughts and you know my experiences. And you know I've talked about my friend. I wrote about her recently on Noel's Notes. If you haven't been reading that, I've been, sharing some of this stuff on there recently. But she started getting groomed by Trump when she was 12. He was hitting on her on his ice rink. When he owned the rink in Central Park, she was taking figure skating lessons there. And he had an eye for picking out the vulnerable young women and girls, So did Jeffrey Epstein. That was their MO. So he started grooming a friend of mine. By the time she was in her teen years, she ended up in Epstein's house with Trump. And she said, "No, you won't believe what those men did to girls in that house and women." And sadly, I would believe it. And that's what they would do. They would abuse people and they would laugh about it, and they would traffic young girls. That's what teen model, Miss Teen USA was Trump publicly flaunting his little herd of teenage beauty contestants. And Les Wexner and Jeffrey Epstein and all his buddies would come take a look at that stuff, and he'd brag about it. There's the famous video that I've talked about that everybody's seen with Trump all coked out of his mind at Mar-a-Lago talking to Jeffrey Epstein. And Trump whispers in Jeffrey's ear and Jeff bends over like embarrassed. Imagine being the guy who makes Jeffrey Epstein double over and be like, "Bro, that's gross." Like, even for me, that's how Trump is. He talks like a maniac. Like, even normal dudes, and there's nothing normal about those kind of guys, but like, there's normal guys, guys talk about girls like, "Oh, look at her, look at those tits," or whatever, Trump doesn't talk like that because he's so sick. You heard him on the Access Hollywood tapes, like, "I grabbed her by the pussy." Nobody talks like that. Like, what? That's who he is. He's so deranged. And I don't want to get too deep into this stuff, like, but read the, some people call her Katie or whatever. There's a Jane Doe court document where, under deposition, a young woman talked about how she was abused by Trump in Epstein's house. And I believe her 100% because it's exactly how he talks and behaves. And at the end of having two young women fillet him, he slaps them around and says they're doing it wrong. That's Trump in a nutshell. I'm sorry to be so graphic, but if you could distill that man's personality down into one action, it's that. He's having two girls perform oral sex on him and then complains that they're doing it wrong and beats them, essentially. And that's a hard thing to say on a podcast, but that's the reality of this man who is now president of the United States for the second time. And that sort of behavior was really no secret. Something like that was definitely in the shadows, but it was public knowledge in 2016. And she was going to take him to court, and then she got threatened. And I don't want to get all into that, but she got the famous lawyer, his name is escaping me now, and she got death threats and just disappeared. And she's one of dozens, if not hundreds, both on Trump's roster and Jeffrey Epstein's. And don't let him tell you that they weren't friends. Melania hung out with Ghislaine. They used to come to the old Rock and Roll Hall of Fame galas that we used to do in the Waldorf back in the day before it was a big TV show on HBO. Now it's a big arena show, and I did some of those, but I've talked about this before. Back in the day, it was in a hotel ballroom at the Waldorf, which just reopened the other day with $1 billion plus facelift, a couple billion. But Melania would come with Ghislaine and that model, Naomi Campbell. And I've told this story. I got into a beef one time because I was trying to get Brian May from Queen, who was sat at the back of the room, the little ballroom. It's not a big room. And I was trying to pull him to stage, and the table right behind him was Naomi, Ghislaine Maxwell, Melania, and a bunch of other slobs. And what's her name? Naomi wouldn't get out of the way. So I kind of pushed her, chair forward a little bit, and she barked at me, and I kind of stepped on her dress and stuff. She was very vicious, beautiful, but vicious. But anyway, so this was no secret. They were palling around. Epstein would fly on Trump's, Air Force One, not the thing he gets now, but his old plane, his 757, which, by the way, he used to fly down to Mar-a-Lago every weekend or every time he went down there in the winter, his entire adult life, ever since he bought that thing, which is almost like in the 80s or something when he got Mar-a-Lago. Imagine that. You're flying down to Florida in a 757 just because you got to show everybody that your dick is bigger than everybody else. You can't just get a Gulfstream like every other, millionaire and billionaire, because back then there weren't a gazillion billionaires, right? But there was rich dudes, and you'd get on a private jet and you'd fly out of Teterboro or something in a normal, 8 passenger, 16 passenger, whatever. That's more baller than buying a commercial airliner to bring yourself and your family down to Florida for the weekend. But that's what Trump would do. So you think of that carbon footprint. Think about how much fuel he dumped in the atmosphere. He has a hand in these climate deaths personally, because his buildings in Manhattan were always the biggest offenders when it came to climate protocols that were put in later. They'd put these scrubbers on the top of the buildings, and he was always in violation. His buildings were. And they didn't pay the fines because they didn't care. So you think about that. Think about the morality of this guy, not just his own predation against people, but his own philosophy, his own consumption. Because this is on all of us. Climate change is on all of us. Dick Cheney used to say, like, conservation is a personal virtue. No, it's not. It's a public responsibility at this point. You got to conserve where you can. And we're at the opposite now. So I know I'm talking about two different things kind of here, but they dovetail together, right? Because it's that mental attitude of, like, the world is mine to exploit. Pretty young women are mine to abuse, and I'll lure them in to my wealth. That's what he did with Trump model management. He would fly these young women over from Eastern Europe. This is after the fall of the Soviet Union, the collapse of the Soviet Union, all these satellite countries, Eastern Bloc countries. Obviously very beautiful women over there to his taste. There's beautiful women all over the world. I like them all, baby. You know what I mean? But Trump has very specific sort of Aryan tastes. He liked those hard-looking Eastern European, Melania, Ivana. That's his gig. Because he's a Nazi, basically. He thinks that's what, like, beauty should be or whatever. So he would bring these women over, girls, teenagers, and he'd put them up in these apartments on the Lower East Side. And there'd be like 8 of them in a bedroom with no air conditioning, sleeping on bunk beds in the summer. Lucy Osborne, who's a reporter for The Guardian, wrote a great article about it years ago, and I gave an interview to her. If you want to read more about that, completely exploitative. And Ivanka knew about that. He brought his daughter into that business. He brought Ivanka to the Look Model of the Year contest, which was a big part of that whole thing, and it's John Casablancas and everything. He brought his kid. You've seen that famous picture where he's clutching her hand and she's dressed in like a kind of a gold lame outfit. She looks like she's 35 and she's like, a child. That was the night she got her modeling contract, and it was a proud night for him. It's gross. He made her the host of the teen beauty pageants, starting in Corpus Christi. That's when she gave him a lap dance in front of the cameramen and stuff. He was checking the girls' mouths, checking their breasts, making little notes, grabbing their asses. He's a pervert. Ask anybody who's been around the dude. He's disgusting, and he would do that stuff with impunity. You've seen the picture of Ivanka giving him like basically a lap dance on his lap at Mar-a-Lago, and the other couple's giving him a side eye. Like there's a dude in that photo, he's got a multicolored sweater, and he's like, what is happening here? And she's like grinding on her dad's lap. And the Beach Boys were playing, by the way, minus Brian Wilson, R.I.P., the later Beach Boys, the Mike Love sort of Republican Beach Boys. I love the original Beach Boys, and what a loss on Brian Wilson. But, this was like 1995 or 4 or 6 or something. Most 14-year-old girls weren't listening to the Beach Boys and so excited about them that they'd hop on their dad's lap because they were hearing a Beach Boys tune. But, Ivanka was, because she was sort of performing for her dad. She would manipulate him. She knew how to use her looks and his attraction to her benefit. She would bring her friends home after she got kicked out of Chapin. She got sent up to Rosemary Choate Hall, whatever. It's a fancy prep school in Connecticut. And he gave her an SUV so she could still go clubbing at night because she was a party girl in her model years. And this girl who was a friend at the time talked about it in an interview. I didn't know any of this. This is before I knew him. But she would bring her girlfriend home like on the weekends to spend the weekend, and he would like ask her, the girlfriend, Trump would like, how would you rate her friends? Like, who do you think's the hottest? Who's a 10? Who's a 6? You know, like that's how Trump talks. He would walk around Trump Tower and hit on high school girls that were coming in there to use the restroom. There was a public restroom in the lobby, and it was widely known. So if you were on a school trip in New York City, if you were coming in from Jersey or Long Island or something, going to galleries or museums, you know, there's not a lot of public restrooms in New York City on Fifth Avenue, and there was one in his building. And everyone knew it, and he knew it. And he would patrol the lobby. You know, he's a sick dude, and he got away with it because he's rich, you know. And he had ex-NYPD cops on his payroll, and often still on the job cops that were working, you know, moonlighting for him. So he set up his world so he could be a predator, and now he's setting up his country so he can be a predator. And now it's gone, you know, it's gone beyond levels that any of us have seen. And it's not just a budding authoritarian regime. It's also a human rights disaster with ICE and these raids and these concentration camps and Alligator Alley. What is that? You're torturing human beings. You're putting them in tents in the Everglades in July, in August. What's going to happen when a big storm comes, which there's one predicted right now that's forming, you know, down there off the Gulf or wherever? You know, what's going to happen when those things slam into the Everglades and the floodwaters rise and these guys are in cages and tents? They're going to drown, and these guys know they're going to drown, you know? They know what's going to happen, and they're getting off on it, and they're looking for a confrontation, rather, which is bringing me to my main point that I want to talk about today, because, like, we're being tested. There's no doubt about that, and there's no way you're not getting angry if you're watching this stuff like I'm watching. It's impossible not to, but we have to temper our anger with like a spirituality, with you know, with reacting out of peace and nonviolence. And I don't mean we don't have to get radical to stop him. We do. We need work stoppages. We need to take to the streets. We need to boycott every son of a bitch who's supporting him. Stop buying crap on Amazon. Stop buying plastic junk that's made out of oil. You know, do everything you can. It matters. Buy local, buy organic, buy reused, you know, recycle stuff. Like, because anything you're doing to feed an industry that's benefiting from his policies is making you less safe and is potentially an existential threat to your life, you know, your lifestyle. We were talking about the wealth before. You know, we would have in this country, when the war on poverty began, we came up with a poverty line where it's like, now I think it's around $35,000, family of 4, right? Anybody on or below that line, you're living in poverty, and you're entitled to get some benefit from your government, because you're going to have harm come your way. If not, you know, you're just going to be scraping by, but you should have some safety measures, right? The inverse of that is an affluence line, where above a certain amount, if you're collecting this much money and you're not paying it back in taxes, that is bad for the country, because that much wealth turns into a power that corrupts, because you're able to buy judges and politicians and men like that sit on the Supreme Court right now that just voted to allow the dismantling of the Department of Education, right? Who's that going to hurt? It's not going to hurt the rich kids. It's going to hurt people who go to public school like myself, you know? It's going to decimate it. And it's also going to be a grift, because they're going to take all that cash and they're going to give it to these like whack job Christian, like Southern fucking, you know, cult academies that are churning out these Christo-fascist psychos, like the one who murdered a speaker of the, you know, Wisconsin House that no one even talks about anymore. I think it's been a month since I've done this podcast, so I don't even think I discussed it on the last podcast because it hadn't happened yet. But think about that, because there was a tide, you know, in the House and the Senate. There was basically, like it is at the national level, it was pretty much 50-50. So a guy went out and had a list of people he killed to tilt the legislator in favor of Republicans. And he was a Christian dude who'd gone to a school in Texas that like churns out really extreme versions of this kind of theology. And I'm not saying all Christians are bad. They're not. But these guys are militarizing it, to take away a woman's right to abortion and to put their sort of draconian ideals onto women and subjugate us. They're bad dudes. And this guy was a fucking terrorist. And he murdered a woman in the middle of the night and killed her dog, killed her husband, went over to somebody else's house, shot the senator, shot the wife, lined up the daughter who lived against a wall, assassinated him with a scary mask, right? And that disappeared from the news cycle. That was a line that we crossed as a nation, and it was pushed out by the very next scandal, because there's so much, or horror rather, not scandal, because there's so much insanity coming at us so fast. And it's hard to not get overwhelmed. It's hard to not get angry. We need to look to the leaders we've had in the past. Look at Dr. King, Look at Gandhi. Look at Thich Nhat Hanh. Thai, they call him, if you know who I'm talking about. A Buddhist monk who came out of Vietnam, who got exiled because nobody liked him. Our military regime in South Vietnam didn't like him. And Ho Chi Minh and his guys didn't like him in the north. He was a man without any land because he wanted peace instead of violence. And so he got exiled and he went to France and he opened a monastery called Plum Village, and he started speaking about peace, but a radical way of achieving peace. Like it begins with you. It's not just ignoring it and pushing it out. It's overcoming your own anger, because everybody has anger. Everybody has the seeds of anger in their consciousness. That's a sort of a Buddhist precept. And if you water it, it'll grow. It'll come into your, go from your subconscious into the front of your brain. And it's not good for you, and it's not good for the world. And I've been ODing on it. This is 10 years this month I've been talking about Trump. And most of the time, I'm pretty pissed off. All my car rants, pretty pissed off. A lot of the writing I've done, pretty pissed off. That's why I did a lot of comedy, because I was trying to, make it palatable and therapeutic for myself as an artist and for anybody who was watching it. But nothing's funny now. I'm not going to make jokes about this stuff. I'll still bring humor into my work, but I'm not doing any sets on Trump anytime soon. Because this is no fucking laughing matter. That was the first term. And that wasn't funny either, but it wasn't what we have now. What we have now is all hands on deck. We need a consciousness transformation. We need to transform this stuff. We need to sort of transmute all this anger into something different. And that begins with us, each as individuals. Because there's a lot of rage farming going on, right? It's easy to say, breaking news, look at this horrible thing he just did, and it's easy to get pissed off about it, and it's easy to share that, and it's easy to get likes, and, that formula is out there, and it's monetized, and it makes a lot of money for a lot of people, and I've talked about that before. I'm not saying it now to judge. What I'm saying is we've seen the results of that. We've seen where that gets us, and it basically empowers Trump, because it keeps him at the front of our consciousness, and allows him to do things like, when it comes out that FEMA didn't answer 1,000 calls, he can send a tweet about Rosie O'Donnell, who's a wonderful, who I know. And, he can send a tweet about her. I'm not friends with her. She follows me on social media and compliments me and likes my stuff sometimes. And I've worked with her on live shows, and she's a true artist. And she left the country and went to Dublin, and she's doing stand-up in Dublin clubs and stuff right now, because she has to be involved with this stuff. That's who she is. She's got to speak out against suffering, whether it's in this country or in Gaza, wherever. She's got a big heart, and she's got a forceful sense of morality, of what's right and wrong. And she's hated Trump, and she saw his bullshit early on. So they've been feuding for decades, and he's had a big resentment against her. So he knows he can crank up that kind of old row, and it'll catch the airwaves. It'll go all over Twitter and everything, and that's what happened. But that's on purpose. So if you're spreading those tweets and all of that, you're just helping him in a way. That's not to say it shouldn't be commented on. I wrote about it on Substack. But you don't have to take the bait when he's trying to change the narrative, because he's trying to change it from the Epstein files, that he was going to release and that, Pam Bondi was going to put out there. And, oh, never mind, because Trump's all over that stuff. There isn't really a list, so to speak, but there's all kinds of evidence that Bill Barr got out of the townhouse on East 71st Street. The Epstein Island, they call it, right? I'll do another show on that, because that's so sick. And they didn't even raid that stuff until they'd already killed the guy in the Manhattan jail, which Barr ordered that hit. I promise you, okay? Bill Barr's dad, Donald Barr, Chester the molester, is what they called him when he taught at Hackley. He's the guy who hired Epstein to teach at Dalton. Epstein was just a student at Cooper Hewitt, or not Cooper Hewitt, that's a museum, Cooper Union or something. He had a physics degree. So he got pulled up to Dalton to teach when he didn't even have his degree yet. He's teaching at one of the elite prep schools in Manhattan. He was there to be a wingman for Donald Barr, who was a pervert, who wrote the sci-fi novels about having sex with teenagers, space aliens. It was called Space Relations. I've done so many years on this stuff. I don't want to get too deep into that weeds, but there's a lot of there. Let's just put it that way. And it's not just Trump. East 71st Street, you keep walking down the block, you got the Koch brothers at 740 Park Avenue, walk out the side door, walk down to Epstein's house. Next door, you got Howard Lutnick, who bought his townhouse, number 11. It was number 9 and number 11, right? Epstein's was 9, Lutnick's was 11. If I'm not getting them mixed up, and I don't think I am. Lutnick bought his place from Epstein's brother. Jeffrey's brother brokered the deal. So he was right next door to all the comings and goings. And I lived in Carnegie Hill, same block, 20 blocks north, right? I go to a meeting right around the corner from there. So when all this went down, when Epstein was offed, I would go to my meeting, and I went there the day after Epstein was off. I was coming back from a gig in D.C., a comedy show, and stopped at the beach for the day in New Jersey and heard about Epstein getting arrested. And then, subsequently later that summer, or not even that summer, it didn't even take long, he got offed, right? So I rode by to go to my meeting. I'd go down Fifth Avenue, and I'd make a left on 71st Street. And I remember outside, right after, in the initial, hours after he was offed, a couple reporters did live remotes from outside of his townhouse. But then for a week after, there was a single RT reporter, Russian television, Russian news reporter, standing outside for a week doing hits. And I'm like, why are the Russians so interested in Epstein's death? The American press has moved on, but the Russians are standing out here for a reason. The Russian consulate is on 91st Street between Madison and 5th, right? The same consulate where somebody was murdered, beat to death the night Trump got elected in 2016. So essentially, Epstein's townhouse was a compromise factory, because a lot of rich, powerful dudes would go there. Bill Gates has been there. Elon Musk has been there. Clinton has been there. I'm not throwing Clinton completely under the bus with all this stuff. Clinton is obviously no angel, I'll put it that way. But he's more like an old school woman's man, like ladies' man kind of poonhound who's really done some inappropriate things. I'm not excusing it. He's not at the same level of predation as Trump, I promise you that. Prince Andrew is. You know what I mean? So anyway, compromise factory. If you're handing off compromise, that consulate, the Russian consulate, was kind of like the spy consulate, right? It was very kind of hush-hush. It's where people would go get their visas and stuff. But, its purpose was, a headquarters for their, espionage industry. So if you're handing off stuff in the middle of the night, that's the perfect location. Because Jeffrey could walk out of his place, walk up Fifth Avenue, sit on a dark park bench next to the wall, next to the park. Perfect drop spot, for many years. So they got reams of information on Russia. And they got a vested interest in all this. And I know this stuff veers into conspiracy theories, but conspiracies exist. They're real. There are conspiracies in the world. People conspire to do all kinds of shit, like the Russians helped Trump conspire to win the election in 2016. Robert Maxwell Ghislaine's father, who died mysteriously, was all in the Kool-Aid in Russia, you know? So I'm not gonna diverge into that, you know, and I know the internet's probably full of it these days, but there's a lot of there. Let's suffice it to say there's something at the FBI. It's not there's nothing here, just forget about it, move on, as Trump wants people to say. Because he knows. You know, he knows how many times he was there. He knows what he did there. And so do other people. And he's basically gotten away with it. The only way he doesn't get away with it is if that stuff comes out. And it ain't going to come out during his administration. So anyone who even believed it would is kind of delusional at this point. But luckily, a lot of the MAGA people, you know, he used that as a manipulative tool. It's how Dan Bongino and all these idiots, you know, sell their podcasts and stuff. So he has a bit of a reckoning on his hands with this stuff. And what it should do is refocus people on the actual facts of what you already know about his predation. What you know from the E. Jean Carroll case should be enough. You know, what you know from the Stormy Daniels case should be enough. You know, his comments on that Access Hollywood tape should be enough to know the guy's not morally fit to be president. Anyway, I'm getting off on the tangent. What I'm talking about here, I was talking about Thich Nhat Hanh. I was talking about, like, we all have that anger, and all of this stuff is incredibly anger-inducing. And that kind of anger is what was so deftly manipulated by Putin in the first election, right? It's how they sort of created the MAGA brand, as I've discussed before. Jared Kushner went to his buddies at Palo Alto, you know, who worked at Facebook and stuff that he'd gone to Harvard with, and out in California in Palo Alto or wherever it is. And he would say, how do I micro-target people? You know, he learned how to micro-target. He learned how to find out, like, you know, who are guys that voted for Obama, they're in a union, you know, they make 60 grand a year, but they also have a Kid Rock CD and they belong to the NRA. Who are those dudes, white dudes, you know? And they found out how they could get these specific demographics in these swing states, in places like Michigan and Pennsylvania and Ohio and stuff, right? So he got that information and he fed it to the Russians, and he said, these are the people we need to turn to win this election. And the Russians hit them with psychological ops. And a lot of those psyops centered around child abuse and predation, because they knew in that demographic, as in most demographics, that people have their own stories of abuse, right? That it's a trauma. It's an open wound that you can sort of press to push people and get them really motivated. So they started spitting out conspiracy theories. Hillary Clinton is running a child sex ring, you know, Pizzagate, which came a little later, but fed that same beast, you know, that if you vote for these guys, that's who you're voting for. And that stuff spread around the manosphere and the right-wing broadcasters and all this stuff. And, you know, it helped him get elected, right? Because it tapped into anger, to people who couldn't overcome their anger and lost their rationality, rather, right? Because you'd have to be an idiot to think that, like, Hillary Clinton was the one who was involved with sex trafficking and Donald Trump was innocent, you know, that he was so against it that he kicked Jeffrey Epstein out of Mar-a-Lago because he hit on a young girl. That ain't how that shit went down, okay? Alex Acosta, who was Trump's secretary, it was a transportation, it was labor, it's escaping me in the moment. He worked in Florida at the time. I believe he was the AG. I think Pam Bondi worked under him, right, if I'm getting it correct, when Epstein got his first deal in Palm Beach, when he got this sweetheart deal, which allowed him to leave prison during the day and go back to his mansion in Palm Beach, where he continued to abuse teenage girls. He would have them come give him massages during the day while he was out. And then he'd go back to prison at night. That's what he was in prison for doing, you know, or in jail, right? That's how, like, they coddled and protected this guy. It's no accident that Acosta got brought into Trump's, you know, cabinet. And then when Epstein scandal broke the first time, Alex Acosta was sort of the, you know, he took the friendly fire. He had to go. He had to finally take, you know, if somebody was going to get fired, it was him, and he got fired. And that guy's a freak. If you ever looked at him and his wife and his kids, like, his kids have a, you know, scary look. I feel for children of men like that, you know. I don't know anything about their lives, but if you know what I'm talking about, if you've seen that picture when he was standing with his wife and kids, it's fucking terrifying. Brett Kavanaugh, right? Guy with a gambling addiction, clearly a predator, clearly a rapist, you know? Alcoholic, right? On the Supreme Court. Why did Justice Kennedy leave? Now I sound like it because he's involved with all this, right? Deutsche Bank, Russian loans, right? It all melds together. There is a global kind of conspiracy of wealthy men who want to sort of flaunt the law, you know, and not just in terms of abusing young women, which they do, and I've discussed that on Other Politics, because it's like, you know, if you're a billionaire, you can walk into any bar and probably hook up, right? So they want something that they feel is even more exclusive. You know, so they want a private island where they can just, you know, do whatever the hell they want to people. Epstein had a dental chair on that island, and when that first case went down in Florida, he had an industrial shredder shipped to the island and a tile remover. So they removed the tiles and the dental chair and used an industrial shredder for something when he knew he was taking that first deal in Palm Beach. I'm not making this up. You can look it all up. It's all part of the public record, right? And this was all in the replica of the sex castle that he built. You know, he built a replica on that island of the cover of Donald Barr's book on sex relations, the sci-fi sex fantasy book that Bill Barr's father wrote, okay? There was a replica of that on Epstein's island. I know that sounds absolutely batshit crazy. I feel crazy saying it. It is all true, okay? So there's a lot of freaky shit there. And what happens is if you can ensnare people in that freaky shit, powerful men, heads of state, princes, then you own them. Then when you need that loan, or when you need to launder that money, or when you need to press, you know, that pressure point on a Supreme Court justice, and I'm not saying that Justice Kennedy had anything to do with that, but something made him retire, you know, something with his son or whatever. In Deutsche Bank, his son worked at Deutsche Bank and was involved in these Russian loans, you know. There was a whistleblower who used to follow me from Deutsche Bank, and he was kind of well known a little bit on the internet, and he died. He was found like suicided in California years ago. And there was a lot of Russians who died the night of the 2016 election. They flew off of roofs and stuff, you know, and not to mention the guy who was bludgeoned in the consulate. So there was a lot of people involved in a lot of dark shit, and you have to clean up that mess, except for the people who get to ascend, you know, to the highest points of power. And Howard Lutnick, who lived next door to all this stuff on 71st Street, is the Commerce Secretary right now. And Lutnick had a fundraiser. This was in May, all right? This was about a couple weeks before Epstein got popped. It was the end of May 2019, okay? Trump was already president. They were raising money for the re-election for 2020. So he calls a fundraiser, and he's had several since, one even in the same townhouse, and one in East Hampton last summer or something. A Watermill, I think, is where he lives, or his Hampton's home. Anyway, he has a fundraiser, and he's got, like, you know, Steve Wynn, Giuliani. Like, it was just Trump himself. Like, it was 30 men, and they raised like $15 million, and it was all these predator types. And I was riding my bike again to the meeting, and I've stopped because the police, Trump was still president. So they blocked off the street. You couldn't walk when they pulled up. And I saw Steve Wynn walking across the street. And at this point, Steve was practically blind. He was in bad health. He didn't travel a lot. I knew Steve a little bit because I used to work for a rock star. I was friends with him, and we'd go to the Palm in Vegas, and I did a VMAs there and stuff. So I kind of knew Steve's deal. And this rock star was friends with his wife. We would get perks there in Vegas. And he doesn't travel because he was in bad shape. So I knew if Steve Wynn was in New York City, something was up. And my theory, and I can't prove this, is that, you know, they got some kind of idea that something was going down with Epstein, and they called a meeting, and they said, kind of pony up. You know, the boss is going to make this problem go away. We'll get Bill Barr on it or something, but we're going to need some cash in reserve. And they ponied up, and they raised a bunch of money. Epstein got popped shortly after that, and he was dead by the end of the summer. you know? These things aren't just coincidence, right? There's too many convenient deaths around Donald Trump. Harold Bornstein, who was his Dr. Feelgood, died right after, the January 6th, 2021, right? A couple weeks later, when Trump was leaving office, his longtime doctor found dead in his house in Scarsdale. The guy was giving him all the Adderall and all the benzos for so many years. The gastroenterologist, the guy with the long hair, giving him all his pills. Dr. Feelgood, dead. So nobody could ever follow up on the addiction narrative or anything. It's things break Trump's way. Don't even get me started on Ivana. I didn't mean to get into all this. I mean to talk about the good news. The good news, what can you do about it? You can bring peace into yourself. You can pick up, a book that makes you feel better. You can pick up some music that makes you feel better. You can talk to a friend. You can garden. You can get in the arts. You can do whatever it is, as I say every week. But there's real spiritual work to be done. And it begins at home. It begins with that transformation. When you feel that rage coming up, you gotta like be an alchemist. You gotta turn it into something else. And you start simply. You start with the breath. You can go on YouTube where you might be watching this, or if you're listening to it, listen to some of his meditations, his talks. It's all about the breath. Breathing in, breathing out. Being conscious of the breath. Walking meditations. Things where you're out in nature and you're listening to the birds and you're feeling your feet on the grass and you're watching the flowers and you're watching the bees. That's nature. That's what we're fighting for, because that's what we're up against. This isn't just, a political thing where it's one party or another. This is right and wrong. This is the war, that's going to just engulf us all, as we see spreading around the globe. The human suffering. In all my life, we've never had such a moment of so much calamity and suffering. It's a lot to take in. And you feel like, what can I do about it? That's where you begin. You get out in nature. You learn these things, which are really hard to do. It takes practice. It's called a practice, And the more you can get present, the more you can get in the moment and connect with your breath, connect with your own awareness and mindfulness, the more you won't get sucked into the anger. Because that's what he wants. He wants to suck everybody into anger, and he wants somebody to start shooting ICE officers so he can crack down on everybody. He's trying to force that confrontation. He's clearly trying to do that in California, and he hasn't done it because people are hip to it. They're not taking the bait, which is amazing because they're basically under assault. And he's going to bring that to New York City next, according to the New York Times. And it might be a little more difficult in New York because, they're tough in California, but you know how New Yorkers are. It's a tight urban area, and that's going to be pretty gnarly, and he knows that. He's looking for a confrontation so he can just crack down and declare martial law, and we can't let him do that. We have to demand peace of our own heart, right? Of our own leaders, and then we can transform this situation. I don't have the answers as to how we're going to get rid of this guy, but the more we come together in a collective consciousness, the closer we are to being on that road. If we splinter off, if we just, fall into violence and start attacking these thugs that are running around pretending to be law enforcement, these ICE officers, these toadies, these fascists, and they make you angry. I get it, right? But if you pick up a gun or a rock and you hurt them, you're not going to be able to take on the United States Army or the National Guard or whatever kind of Gestapo tactics Trump brings down upon us. And those centers are being set up for everybody. He wants to use them for migrants now, and this is where we have to stop them. We have to take to the streets, because next it will be us. It'll be the rest of us, rather, because they are us. They are just as American as we are. I don't care where you were born. I don't care what your immigration status is. You're in this country working hard to feed your family. You're a fellow citizen. You're a fellow human being. You deserve every right I have. And you certainly don't deserve to be deported or thrown into a cage in a swamp by some fascist from Santa Monica, who works for a guy who's a lifelong racist, who's rather be on the golf course counting his crypto billions than governing a country. you know. And Trump's a sick dude. He'll have no problem murdering a bunch of people. He wanted to do it in the first term, in the face of the, you know, Black Lives Matter protests. You know, he wanted to murder people across the street from the White House. So, you know, people start popping off on the ICE officers. That's what's going to happen. And I'm not saying don't resist. I'm not saying don't get in their faces. I'm not saying don't, you know, make human chains and block their entry where you can. Do it all. And that takes courage and bravery. You know, you've never seen in this country more bravery than was on display in Selma and Dr. King's marches, right? They knew they were going to get clobbered, you know, by these Southern cops, and dogs were going to get sicked on them, and their kids were going to get, you know, hit with fire hose water and all this stuff. And they did it anyway. They marched with dignity and peace because they knew that was the way, right? If they had picked up guns then, it would have been all over. They would have been slaughtered, you know. And they tried to put all that stuff on Malcolm X and the, you know, the Black Panthers, and look how they, you know, were able to just bullshit about their violent intentions and take them out violently, essentially. And those guys were just feeding kids and protecting their community, you know. So the MAGA people behind Trump, they'll buy any of his bullshit. They'll say, hey, sorry, it seemed bad, but they were attacking your beloved ICE officers, you know, and then it's all over. And we can't allow that. We have to work towards peace, and that begins in your own heart. That begins with each one of us. Okay? I'll talk more about this next time. I just wanted to check in with you guys. You know, that's sort of my message. I talk about it a little bit every time on the Noel's Notes and Substack. So thanks for signing up for that. You know, you can find me wherever you find me on the socials. Thank you for listening. And, you know, be well. Take care of yourself. We're in tumultuous times, to say the least. But that doesn't mean joy isn't our birthright. That doesn't mean love and compassion can't be shared freely in your life, in your community. Share it with every living being, because we're doing this for all the beings, the bugs, the birds, you know. Everything is at stake, and we're gonna win. We're gonna overcome this moment, and we have to draw on the strength of our elders to do that. We have to draw on the wisdom of nature and this land and the Native Americans and the people that really knew how to live in harmony with this universe. We need to call on their strength, right? It might sound hippy-dippy. Hippy-dippy's all we got right now, you know? It's not all we got. We got each other, right? Okay, so I'm going to shut up because I've been talking for a while. I hope you're well. I hope you're staying cool. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time. Peace.